Hello, viewers. Allow us to welcome you to another Politics of Nuclear Non-Proliferation podcast. My name is Albert,
And I'm Marek.
and the topic we'll be discussing in today's episode is going to be Vladimir Putin and the Madman theory. In the first part, we will address the rhetoric of Russian elites with respect to the Russo-Ukrainian war and compare them to their official doctrine. Then we will talk about what the actual Madman theory maintains.
For the second part, we have invited an esteemed guest, Dr. Nick Campbell-Seremetis from the University of Columbia, Saltzman Institute for War and Peace Studies. Since he studies the role of psychological factors on international politics and bargaining, he'll certainly help us to explain the Western perception, or rather misperception, of Vladimir Putin and his policies.
Now, since the 24th of February 2022, we have been witnesses to a lot of previously unimaginable events, such as full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, ruthless conduct of war, especially from the Russian side, and from the Russian side also high readiness of strategic armament. I don't know about you, Marek, but a few months ago, I would have considered someone who committed such actions outright mad.
Yeah, this brings us to the next important point, which is how to decide what is madness and who is really mad and who is the so-called rational actor. And can madness be potentially part of a strategy? We'll address both these questions, but before that, it is useful to take a look at what has been stated from the Russian side.
Mm-hmm. For example, Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen leader and one of Putin's closest associates, has announced in October that Moscow considers using tactical nuclear weapons on Ukraine.
The same goes with Dmitry Medvedev, who in September said that NATO is too scared to enter Ukraine directly and warned that attacking Crimea would mean, quote, Judgment Day.
Mm-hmm. Another Russian prominent, the foreign minister Dmitry Lavrov, has said in April that the West should not underestimate the possible use of nuclear weapons over Ukraine, as Russia may perceive NATO as a part of the conflict. Thus, that would mean that Russia would be using nuclear weapons in defense. However, almost immediately, he tried to calm down the situation and declared that Russia's use of nuclear weapons should remain purely defensive because nuclear war cannot be won and thus it should not be fought.
Of course, the last and the most important man, Vladimir Putin, on the 27th of February, put the deterrent forces, which is just another term for Russian nuclear forces, to high alert. And in October, Putin admitted that there is a possibility of use of nuclear weapons by NATO, and that, quote, we will without question use all the means at our disposal to protect Russia. That's not a bluff, end of quote. So as you can see, Putin has never directly threatened with the use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield, nor with the first strike against the West. And his remarks, as those of the others, Kadyrov and Lavrov, do not name nuclear weapons specifically, but they are reliant on the fact that the reader can quickly make out the meaning.
I must say I'm pretty confused by this schizophrenia. How about we compare these statements with the official Russian doctrine concerning the use of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I think this is really important because the West oftentimes simply concludes that the Russian strategy is based on the idea of escalate to de-escalate, where one side raises the stakes so long and so high that the other side is not willing to continue and concedes. It is, however, more complex than that.
Mm-hmm. So instead of escalate to de-escalate, we should speak of escalation management or some sort of ladder where a Russian response is scaled down to the crisis at hand.
Exactly. Actually, the Russian scale distinguishes three elements of escalation management. The first one is the demonstration of force, which can be further distinguished during peacetime and military threat. During peacetime, the goal is the demonstration of the possession of force and engagement in non-military measures. A typical example here is military parades where new types of weapons can be presented. As for the military threats, this includes demonstration tests of new weapons and increased readiness of armed forces, and of course also military exercises. And most importantly, threats to inflict damage on important objects with non-nuclear means. As for the military threat, here would also belong the so-called red sling of nuclear saber. That is not something new, as Vladimir Putin threatened with the use already in 2014.
The second step of escalation management is adequate damage infliction. This revolves around the Russian perception of conventional war, which can be actually distinguished into three phases. The first one, the local war, the second, regional, and third, large-scale war. In these categories, Russians opt to combine conventional and unconventional tactics, as well as the actual use of nuclear weapons. However, not with the intention to annihilate the opponent, however, usually to deter or help in a tactical situation, which leads us to the third phase, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, exactly. When we would get to the top of the ladder, there is retaliation. And retaliation includes full-scale nuclear strike, and it is the last resort. When the sides exchange nuclear strikes regularly. And as an example of this would be nuclear war between NATO and Russia, for example. I would like maybe to step back a bit here and ask you about what do you think about the current situation in Ukraine? Do you think that we are in local war or regional war, or at what level of the escalation ladder we would be now?
I think that the current situation lies somewhere between local and regional war, and I can't decide for specific phase. And why do I think so? Well, regional war is specific with the demonstrative use of nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, local war remains with threats. Thankfully, we have so far seen only nuclear threats from the Russian elites, yes? On the other hand, regional war involves mass use of precision strikes on adversary targets, both civilian and military, while a local war contains only limited use. And I think at least since since September 2022, I think the Russian use of bombardment of Ukraine is precisely what regional war characteristics say here. However, should the perceived involvement of the West be higher, I think that would undoubtedly lead to the regional war in all of its aspects.
Yeah, I completely agree with your statement that if NATO would be included, it would only lead to escalation. I think the bottom line here is that, of course, we cannot know what the situation will be a few months from now, and we cannot rule out that the conflict will escalate. For example, if Russia would be losing ground under its feet, then we might get up still in the escalation ladder.
I think that would possibly lead to the doctrine losing its relevance in the debate. We can be certain about the actual Russian intentions and resolve here, as they are in the end dependent on one man only, on Vladimir Putin. And how can we explain his brinkmanship, possibly with Madman theory? Could it help?
Yeah, I think it is great to start here with one name, with Thomas Schelling. It is the man who brought deliberate brinkmanship as a possible strategy in international politics. This brinkmanship means that there is a recognizable risk of war and a risk that one doesn't completely control. Also, he coined the term rationality of irrationality as a way to maintain the credibility of threats. This simply means that sometimes it might be beneficial to act or be perceived as a rational actor, which could lead to some rational compensation.
Mm-hmm. And when we speak of Thomas Schelling, we also have to mention Roseanne McManus and her 2019 article, where she analyzes the role of this perceived madness and compares it with historical records. In her work, she distinguishes madness into 4 categories. The first of which is situational madness that relates to certain issues and circumstances only. Then the second case is dispositional madness, which relates to all issues under all circumstances. The third one is extreme preference, which means high tolerance for risk and expectations of low costs of war. And the final case, the most foolish, is the complete deviation from consequence-based decision making, which means irrational actor in international politics.
Yeah, I think just now maybe we can talk about where we would put Vladimir Putin in this categorization. I think that situational madness here, and maybe with combination with extreme preferences, are most likely the case of Vladimir Putin, because when one possesses situational madness, as you said, he is considered to be irrational only in a limited amount of cases. And for Vladimir Putin, this could be Ukraine, since in his political career, he has otherwise presented himself and wanted to be seen as others by a rational, intelligent leader. Thus, I think we can rule out here the inability of consequence-based decision-making.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree.
Maybe just one more point, because also the extreme preferences we have also witnessed, I think, because as you said, it involves a high tolerance for risk, which certainly was invading or trying to invade all of Ukraine, and also the low cost of war expectation. This fits well Vladimir Putin, because he certainly expected that it would be something like with Crimea in 2014.
Yeah, I agree. And naturally, which goes hand in hand with the situational case here, is that his declarations about using nuclear weapons relate specifically to defending Russian territories. So he still at least attempts to portray himself as rational.
Yeah.
What was interesting for me was that McManus used Adolf Hitler during Sudetenland crisis as a historical example of this combination of situational extreme preference. I don't claim that Vladimir Putin is modern Adolf Hitler. However, this comparison, I think, is at hand because Adolf Hitler was able to persuade Western powers that his aggression and irrationality starts and ends with Sudetenland, something which could be said of Vladimir Putin right now.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sorry.
So sorry. Well, however, I think we both agree that these kind of speculations are analytically complicated. What do you think?
Yeah, of course. I mean, sometimes you have to rely on anecdotal evidence, which is, of course, not good always. So, of course, the Madman theory is disputed and has drawn a lot of attention. For example, Scott Sagan or Stephen Wald questioned its analytical usefulness, and even that it can be potentially harmful in international negotiations. But if we take a look how policymakers approach this theory, it is sometimes favorable because Richard Nixon or Donald Trump expressively said that they wanted to be perceived as madmen. And
yeah,
it is,
Rosen McManus actually criticizes Trump for openly saying that he will be acting like that.
yeah, in relation to North Korea, we have seen the irrationality approach, which I think at least didn't go well. And my question here is, what about Putin? Can we speak of faint irrationality or volatility? And what is the role here of perception and misperception, or is it an effective bargaining strategy in this case?
Well, I'm afraid our knowledge is not sufficient here, so now we would like to welcome here our guest and expert, Dr. Campbell-Seremetis. I should mention again that he works at Saltzman Institute for War and Peace Studies at the University of Columbia and specializes in the psychological dimension of international politics and bargaining. Hello, and thank you for accepting our invitation. It's good to have you here, sir.
Great. So we are back with our esteemed guest, Dr. Nick Campbell-Seremetis, and we would like to ask him some questions related to our topic. And the first one is, what do you consider being the main tenets of Madman theory?
Thank you for having me, first of all. So Madman theory is, talking about main tenets is complicated because the theory itself is not very well laid out. It comes sort of to current political science from Thomas Schelling's sort of biblical almost text, Arms and Influence, and yet in that entire book, it's only got about 6 pages. But the basic core principle is that convincing an adversary that you are insane, crazy, mad, whatever you want to call it, has a particular benefit in international relations and conflict negotiation, which is that because you are crazy, nobody is sure whether you will make good on even a self-destructive threat. And so it lends you a lot of coercive leverage because you can threaten to do anything credibly, whereas someone who is sane would not be able to do that. So a madman could say, I will nuke you even though it will destroy my country. A sane person couldn't say that. That's the very, very simple summary of what Madman theory, I think, is.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the invention of nuclear weapons played some crucial role in establishing this theory or view of international politics, or could we speak of some how can you say it, some influence of mad politicians on international bargaining even before the invention of nuclear weapons?
So I think that madman theory, as it's usually understood, does rely upon the presence of nuclear weapons, because basically nuclear weapons always give you that insane threat that you can make, and it is a mutually destructive threat. So therefore, if you always have the capacity to make a threat that the other side wouldn't tolerate, even though it's very dangerous to you, there is that potential benefit of it. Now, the issue becomes that leaders didn't suddenly start looking or going insane when nuclear weapons were invented. There is a very long history of megalomaniacal or seemingly crazy leaders in international relations. And I think some of the work that I do, the issue is that nuclear weapons are very important. But as we see, for example, in the conflict in Ukraine, which I know we will talk about more later, as much as they are a background thing, oftentimes conflicts occur these days with more conventional armaments or between powers, even two powers that don't have nuclear weapons. And so an interesting question to ask then is, do the tenets of madman theory still hold in those circumstances, or do they fall apart? And I will note, and this is something that I think we can get into a little bit later, but the term I used, there were definitely insane leaders before. It does point out one more important thing, I think, about madman theory that is especially interesting with respect to the context of Ukraine, which is that madman theory kind of is agnostic as to whether the leader is actually crazy. It's all about perceptions. And generally, we as political scientists are not trained to diagnose psychopathy or other kinds of madness, even if we were well trained to define it, which we are not. So the basic point I was trying to make with that was just that when we talk about madman theory, we're really talking about perceived madness, not actual madness. So, yeah.
Maybe in your research, how do you determine and analyze the role of psychological factors?
Explain what you mean by that. So psychological factors is in international politics generally, or in like the perception of someone is mad, or in how a leader?
How do you establish that a leader is mad? Would be the question.
So
I mean,
I would say, interestingly, I don't. What I would do is establish what it means for a leader to be perceived as mad, and ask questions to the population about. So you mentioned, I think, probably in the first part of your podcast, Roseanne McManus, a colleague of mine, and we kind of have different interpretations of what it means to be perceived as mad. I will look at the interpretation or belief that a leader interprets information in a way that is wrong or biased or irrational in some way, and that kind of thing. If I believe that about somebody, what does that then do to the way I interact with them? A good way, and there is that old adage, if you mention Hitler in an argument, you lose the argument, but he's a good example here. So some people would say that he was mad because he wanted to rule the world. I would say that there's nothing mad about that. Plenty of leaders probably want that. What made him mad is that he thought he could do it successfully. Despite all the information that was being presented to him, he thought it was plausible. And so when I try to establish whether a leader is perceived as mad, usually I would start by, surveying people, making sure I have the right kind of question, because it's hard to get accurate reads, but we try with survey data to see what the mass public says, and then I can sometimes extrapolate that to more targeted questions towards policymakers to see what their general interpretation of a leader is. Having said that, again, I think it's important to state that the role of psychology in the decision-making of an individual leader who we don't have direct access to is always going to be theoretical and interpretive, which is, I don't think is necessarily a problem. It just means that it's hard for me to say with certainty that narcissism played this and that role in the decision a leader made.
Maybe a follow-up question here. How to distinguish between a decision maker feigning the irrationality and an actual fool?
I think that this is a very interesting question, and again, it gets down to what is kind of the prior understanding of madman theory, and what I think in this day and age is moved a little bit more towards, which is that feigning irrationality and being an actual, like, you have some circumstances where a leader will basically explicitly say that they're trying to do this. That would be like a Trump or maybe a Kim Jong-un. But it's difficult to say where the line is drawn, because being a fool is subjective. Being a madman is subjective. And so what it really, I think, comes down to is, and the question I would ask is not how do you draw the line, but when is it that these apparently erratic behaviors actually establish a leader's reputation in the eyes of the world as being a madman? Because if you look at Putin, for example, before the invasion of Ukraine, Putin wasn't different. He was doing weird shit like riding tigers and playing hockey and, like, all these things that, like, you could point to in another leader and be like, oh, that's a weird person, but everyone was sort of interpreting him as a strategic genius, and this invasion turned that on its head. But what's interesting about that is that those same kinds of actions weren't doing that before. And so I think that it's less about the feigning and more about the context and sort of the collective interpretation of the world, and how media discusses things when things are brought to their attention. So it's tricky. All psychological factors in international relations are by their nature tricky.
Yeah, that leads us to our next question, which actually concerns the difference between medial portrayal of Vladimir Putin in Russia proper and in the West. As in Russia, he is portrayed as someone, as a genius, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or as a supreme leader. While in the West, he is portrayed as very often he's portrayed as a sick person or someone very paranoid. Does that tell us something about the intentions of a decision maker or political leader? Does that? I'm sorry.
No, it's.
What does it say? It's about the decision maker when he is portrayed in such heterogeneous way at home and abroad.
I think it says that he has control over the media, and that or at least influence over it, and that the media abroad thinks differently. I think that if there's one thing that seems to be a fairly ubiquitous interpretation of Putin outside of Russia, it's that he is narcissistic and megalomaniacal. It doesn't necessarily mean he's mad, but he does like to be portrayed in a very positive light. This is not a unique trait to Putin. In that context, I would just say that it means that, it's a bit of both, right? Like, obviously, you can't discount the role of propaganda and genuine nationalism in feeding these media narratives and making people believe them. But on the other hand, what it shows you is that the media apparatus in Russia is either has bought into Putin's image of himself, or they have a strong incentive to portray that because they know what he wants. It's sort of, you could call it 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Which one is, again, very difficult to say without direct access. But I don't think it necessarily says anything more than it says about, if you were to look at President Trump back in the day, like the different portrayals of him in, by certain American media outlets and then international media outlets.
And would you say that this portrayal, from our perspective, helps Putin, or let's say Trump, in
negotiations?
Yes, in negotiations.
So this is actually where my own research comes right into play, which is that I would say no. And the basic reason is that if you are perceived as a madman, it is true that you can make certain threats slightly more credibly, but it is also true that people will give up on negotiating with you, because if you're going to believe what you're going to believe, then what is the point of sitting down and talking to you? So it very much skips all the steps where you could actually sit at the quote unquote bargaining table. We like to talk about in political science that there's always this bargaining table where people are fighting over a pie and trying to divide the pie. But if one side sees the other side as fundamentally incapable of interpreting information, or maybe I think they're not even bargaining over a pie, maybe they want the table. And so we're talking about two different things. And what's the point of sitting down with them? If you get to the point where you're skipping that step, then the options for the perceived madman are exponentially narrower. It's basically you get everything you want, which is extremely rare, or people will just dig in their heels and fight you. And that is what is currently happening with, I think, Putin and Ukraine. One of the issues that he has been encountering is that the West, by and large, has not been in a diplomatic dialogue with him. There hasn't been a belief that one could sit down and negotiate terms for a cessation of conflict that Putin would actually abide by. And that is because it's sort of believed that he, no matter what happens, will think that he can get away with taking over Ukraine. Whether that's true or not is, of course, for history to tell. But...
So, would you consider Putin's behavior to be effective with respect to the West? Or?
He answered this question. But I would like to develop the previous question. You have done some research. We have also read an article from Rose and McManus, who distinguishes some forms of perceived madness, and she distinguishes that some could be helpful or effective, and some are not. For example, she provides an example with Adolf Hitler during the Sudetenland crisis, where he could have been perceived as someone with extreme preferences, but still is someone who is capable of rational thinking, and it could have helped him. What is your take on that?
So I'm also familiar with Roseanne's work. We've done a lot of discussion and collaboration between different kinds of perceived madness. I think that there are. So first of all, I would point out, this is a discussion we've had, that that is a narrow view of Hitler's overall negotiated conquest, because of course he got this, like, it could have helped him in the Sudetenland, but then what happens the second he moves on, it doesn't, suddenly people aren't negotiating with him anymore. Having said that, in my research, the one time when it is maybe a little bit helpful is when you are perceived as irrational, so you interpret or biased, you interpret information in a way that is favorable to you or does not cohere with how your opponent would interpret it. So I can't make an argument to you or present you data and expect you to draw the same conclusions as me. But if I also think you're competent, right, you're biased, but you're not an idiot, you're biased, but you are strategically sound in your thinking, that can make me kind of want to treat you like I guess the word would be like a cornered Wolverine or something. Like, I don't think I can negotiate with you, but you are very dangerous. And so maybe the incentive to fight you is less. It doesn't necessarily mean I will give you what you want, but it can maybe lead to a situation like what we see in Ukraine, where the West is sending arms, but they're not necessarily sending armies. It's a stretch interpretation. Having said that, yes, I think in certain circumstances it can be useful, which gets back to what we started on about the advent of nuclear weapons being pretty important and why it's seen as a positive thing. Because that is you don't have to be super competent to be dangerous if you have a nuke, right? If you can fire a nuke at somebody, you're always in that Wolverine status. But once you take that out of the picture, suddenly it becomes much less helpful. And then it just becomes a problem of, by being perceived as mad, you are closing off opportunities for negotiation and dialogue. You're closing off opportunities for concessions even. Because if I remember correctly, Roseanne's argument is that people thought that they could get away with conceding to Hitler because he only had these extreme preferences for one thing, which was the Sudetenland. And as it turns out, that was inaccurate.
So what would be your recommendations for the West, for Western leaders, on how to deal with someone such as Putin, who actually possesses nuclear weapons and whose intentions are really unclear, whether he has some disposition or whether he is just bluffing? What would be the rational strategy in this situation to reach some conclusion, negotiations or something like that?
Yeah, I would say that the first thing to do would be saying put yourself in their shoes is always a weird thing, but try and not make subjective judgments about his rationality or irrationality, right? If you close off that line before the line is closed, that's a problem. Now, you could send negotiators, you could send, and he could refuse to talk to them, or he could be impossible to talk to, and then that's one thing. The issue becomes if you don't try. I think that, especially in the modern day and age, an attempt is always important. Having said that, it is a sticky situation. I personally would doubt that Putin would initiate a nuclear strike. It does not necessarily seem to me to be in line with the irrationalities or biases that he has displayed, which are more about Russian nationalism and greatness than they are about being willing to, start a third world war for the purposes of reattaining Ukraine and Russian sovereignty in that area. However, it has to be said that he has been escalating, and I think that the difficulty with that sort of thing is goes back to another shelling metaphor, the rocking of the boat, progressively rocking it more and more and more until eventually it will tip over. And what that tipping over looks like, nobody knows. I would just, from my research at least, the one piece of advice I would give to Western decision makers is try not to be taken in by media narratives regarding the irrationality or lack thereof of Vladimir Putin. I'm not necessarily saying he is or isn't irrational. I don't have a dog in that fight. But just believing one and running with it without actually evaluating its accuracy or trying to test some of the things that it says are infeasible is a poor move, both politically speaking and security-wise.
And did you personally change your opinion on Vladimir Putin since the inception of the war?
Not particularly. I've always thought he was pretty openly devoted to a very sort of nationalistic, imperialistic view of Russia, and that the West's big mistake was thinking that sort of past-oriented viewpoint wasn't going to lead him to do things that might seem strategically stupid. Because his goal isn't necessarily to maximize Russia's economic utility. It's to it's more of a status-oriented goal, it seems to me. So no, I don't think I changed my opinion all that much. But I know many people who did. I know many people who, before the war, were thinking that Putin was a chess master playing four-dimensional chess on the international stage, and now they're kind of calling him a kook, and it's jarring. So
maybe from your statements, I think I know the answer, but would you consider him as a madman or no?
Would I consider Putin a madman? No, I would. I mean, madness is a spectrum. That's the thing about it, and so it's not just mad or not. So in my research, I talk about your competence and your bias or your objectivity. I would say Putin himself, I think, is probably a fairly biased actor. I don't think he's necessarily incompetent himself, but I do think, interestingly enough, he has purged a lot of the competent administration officials from his cabinet, and so you do see the military making kind of dumb moves that don't necessarily belie a clear strategy or cohesion. And this is, again, where, taking psychology into international relations gets complicated, because psychology there's an old saying that psychologists don't have theories, we have lists. And so a list of things that make you irrational is different than you are or not. And it becomes a much more nuanced picture that you have to tease apart. So I would say I don't think he is a perfectly rational actor, but I don't think very many people are perfectly rational actors. He's probably somewhere to the towards the more irrational side, but not like he's not, you know, King George III or anything like that.
So it's more like a fanatic, right? Or like when you talked about the imperialism, but he is still a competent actor. So would you consider him a fanatic?
Yeah, actually, in the dissertation that I wrote, a fanatic is exactly the term that I gave to somebody who was biased but not incompetent. So yeah, a fanatic but not a fool is sort of the way that I would put it.
Okay.
Which means that he, you know, he'll interpret possibilities about the thing he is fanatical about in a way that is positive towards the chances of realizing it, even though it doesn't seem necessarily objective or rational. And that's where he can surprise us. That's why I think why a lot of people were surprised by the initiation of the war, is that nobody thought it was a good idea. Everyone thought it was stupid, and he did it because he has filters over his eyes. That's at least my interpretation. That's my perception. But as I've said before, perception is not reality, and I could be wrong. I very much cop to that.
And also, what do you think of his associates, such as, let's say, Sergei Lavrov, Ramzan Kadyrov, Dmitry Medvedev? Do you think that they play some role in his informing the policy, or rather in establishing some portrayal of Russia's intentions, or they are insignificant in what we think of Russia?
I unfortunately don't have enough familiarity with what they've been doing recently to give you a straight answer on that. I would love to make something up, but I feel like I would be doing it a disservice. I will say that all the reports I've heard say that he's more and more making decisions on his own and shutting out advisors and other figures, but you know, that's something that could be a piece of misinformation. So
no, I think we've covered all the topics. Do you have any questions?
Well, I don't have any questions prepared, but your responses were really interesting. I also wanted to ask you if you would like to add something, what you might consider important for the understanding of what we tried to cover here.
I think that one thing that's important, and I've touched on it a little bit, but just to touch on it a little bit more, is that what Madman theory deals with and what we're dealing with when people talk about is Putin this or is Putin that, it's all about beliefs. And beliefs are unfortunately, they are a really hard thing to measure in political science, and they are a really hard thing to tease out, and like, you know, their effects, it's hard to tease them out. And so this is where empirical work becomes really important. But even then, I think that at least I, as a social scientist, know that I would be fibbing if I said that the methods that we have for investigating the effects of these are perfect. And I know that it's sort of a faux pas for any researcher to say that their work it's informative but not deterministic, or it's informative but not the be-all and end-all. But that's very much where I'm at with this. I think that it's because looking into sort of what could only be called a perception of a perception, like if I think you're mad, it's a question of me. This is what I think about how you see the world. This is what I think about how you see things. It's a perception of a psychology. That's complicated. It starts to get you down to that rabbit hole of like, I think you think, that she thinks, that I think, that you think, that I think, that you think, that I think, that you think. And eventually, you know, it's beliefs all the way down, turtles all the way down. So I think that I would say anybody, just for anyone who wants to discuss rationality and irrationality in international politics, I'm all for it. It's a fascinating topic. But I would just say come to the discussions with a bit of humility, always, because being right in social science is a really rare thing. It's a very, very rare thing. So that'd be about it.
Okay. Well, thank you for your contribution and really appreciate your participation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for your contribution. This should be enriching for all of us. We were glad to hear an expert's opinion.
Let's revise what we have found and conclude today's episode. Madman theory revolves around perceived madness, which could be used as a bargaining tool. The role of nuclear weapons was crucial for the development and possible application of this theory, as it allows a decision maker to maintain the credibility of his threats.
When assessing Vladimir Putin during the Russo-Ukrainian war so far, we might categorize him as someone with heavily biased preferences and who, at the same time, is capable of retaining his rationality. Our expert, Dr. Campbell-Seremetis, considers him as a fanatic but not a fool, which again portrays a decision-maker much more willing to undertake risks. Thus, from the perspective of West, someone who is perceived with doubts over his rationality. Whether this was Putin's intention or not, we have agreed that his approach has been a strategic miscalculation if he wished to coerce the West to relinquish its support of Ukraine.
However, it is necessary to mention that our expert has expressed doubts over the applicability of madman theory in international bargaining. Intended perception may easily be misinterpreted by the recipients, thus producing unwanted results, often in contrast to the goals of the initiator. From the analytical perspective, it is also complicated to apply the madman theory. Concerning psychological factors, our expert has remarked that instead of focusing on the initiator, it is more viable to assess the impact on the audience. We should thus assume our knowledge of Putin's intentions and beliefs is incomplete. Therefore, we cannot determine with certainty that he is a fanatic. His actions and their consequences, however, imply so.
Anyway, thank you for watching this episode of Politics of Nuclear Non-Proliferation. We hope that you have gained knowledge and enjoyed your time as well. See you next time.
Goodbye.